All right, let's go ahead and get started. Those of you in the auditorium, it's time to come on in and save the fellowship for here in a little bit. For those of you that are watching from home, let's get a robe on or something. But good to see everyone here this morning. We appreciate everyone coming out. If you were here last week, or maybe not, this is the part where we have to say, previously on the episode of Amos. And we kind of go back a little bit to kind of paint the stage of what we've been studying. We are in the book of Amos, and we got it kicked off last week. And if you remember, and this is very important, and we won't go back quite this far each time that we come together, but if you remember, back in last week in the chapter 1, we read about Amos, this sheep herder from the area of Tekoa, which is kind of in the southern part of things, and he was sent to the north to talk to Israel. But before he talks to Israel, when we didn't even get to Israel last week, he talks about God's displeasure with 6 pagan regions around them. And we looked at that last week, about how God was just incensed. He had gotten, he just wasn't going to tolerate it anymore about these pagan nations. And if you look through all of it, it was never for their idolatry. It wasn't because they were pagan and they didn't follow God or anything like that. That was almost to kind of be expected because they were apart from God anyways. It was for the way that they treated people. It was their lack of humanity, particularly in these atrocities during the time of war. And God, for 3 transgressions and for 4, and he goes on, in Damascus and Gaza and Tyre and Edom and Ammon and Moab, and God is going to bring some justice. And if you're sitting in Israel at this time up there in the northern kingdom, you're looking, yes, high five. And we talked a little about that last week. In fact, your homework assignment was to come up with 6 groups of people, or people, however you want to do it, that so very much offend you by the way that they live their lives and how they act, their lack of reverence for God or anything holy, and how if I were to get up here this morning and start railing against them, that'd be kind of exciting. We like it when the bad guy gets his. We like it when the good guy, prevails. We like it when justice falls in line with the crimes that we think are really, really bad. And we like our sense of justice. Think about it. We are never the ones that are speeding. We just have an important engagement. It was the other people that were speeding. That's kind of how we look at things. It's okay to smile just because Steve's not here. I realize he's the funny one. I'm not. But it's okay to at least smile for the next few weeks. And so now, after we've gone through all of those, now we're going to pick this up in chapter 2, and we're going to begin in verse 4. We're going to go 4 and 5. Now, here's what happens now. So he spoke about all these pagan nations. Now he's going to talk about Judah. To understand Judah a little bit is to understand what's going on in this period of time. For about 2.5, 2 3/4 kings worth of time, Israel kind of hung in there. Right? Israel they were God's chosen people. They come across, and then God does all this for them. And so, for about 2.5, again, 2 3/4 king, but things start to wobble a bit when Solomon is king. In the beginning, great prosperity, great, protection, just a wonderful situation for Israel. But then Solomon gets led astray. And Solomon stops being a good king. And to be quite frank, he stops being a good dad. And at his death, the kingdom splits. 2 of the tribes go to the south, everybody else goes to the north. The south's called Judah, the north is called Israel. And what we read about as we look at Jeroboam and Rehoboam is that they really weren't good kings. In fact, if you turn in your Bible to 1 Kings chapter 12, just one example, and it sets the stage. 1 Kings chapter 12, beginning in, let's say, call it about verse 28. So the king consulted and made 2 golden calves, and he said to them, "It is too much for you to go up to Jerusalem. Behold, your gods, O God, that brought you up from the land of Egypt." And he set one in Bethel, and then he put the other in Dan. Now this thing became a sin, for the people went to worship before the one as far as Dan. He made houses on high places. He made priests from among all the people who were not the sons of Levi. In essence, the king just kind of went, did something completely different, and immediately promoted a practice of religion and obedience to God, which was completely contrary to what God wanted. And so, as things split, Judah and Israel aren't making great choices. Now, collectively, they are still, part of, the 12 tribes. They are still God's people, but they're not making good choices. I mean, that's part of the reason why Amos is going to go have a little chat with them on behalf of God. They didn't get along real well. I mean, they were kind of, tiffing at each other and fighting and different things like that. And so when in verse 4, my guess is they were probably kind of excited, Israel was, to hear that Judah is now going to get in trouble. And Judah does. And if you go, but during this period of time, one of the things it's kind of interesting that this was a very prosperous time, we're going to talk about, kind of as we get through this, for Israel. Financially speaking, Israel's doing pretty well. The market is up. Everybody owns GameStop. I mean, it's good times here. And so, and they're kind of drunk on that and this new lifestyle, but they'd forgotten God. And so Israel now is listening to this man from the Judean area talk about Judah, and he says in verse 4 and 5, "For 3 transgressions of Judah and for 4." Notice he talks about it the same way. This is kind of his lead-in, meaning that God has had enough. Now, what's different about verses 4 and 5 is that for these 6 pagan nations, God's issue was how they treated other people. Now, when he gets to Judah, Judah's issue is going to be a little bit different. He's going to denounce not these crimes against humanity, things that come up in war. The key to the word is this idea in kind of halfway through verse 4, the rejection. He says, "They have rejected the law of the Lord and have not kept his statutes. Their lies also have led them astray, those after which their fathers walked. So I will send fire upon Judah. It will consume the citadels of Jerusalem." The word here, rejection. Now understand, rejection is a little bit different than sort of slipping your mind. Rejection is a little bit different than "I kind of forgot." I mean, not that those are good things. But rejection is when I know what is right, I understand it and everything like that, but yet I'm going to say no to this and I'm coming over here. That is to reject. To understand, to take the time, to somehow, you grasp it and you say no. Remember those times whenever you kind of had this really good idea on how your parents ought to spend money? Remember that growing up? There's this really idea, and you would kind of lay it out. I remember one time, it was the cutest thing, and it almost pained me to say no as strongly as I did. Is he in here? Make sure not. I got a PowerPoint presentation one evening on this great idea that one of the boys had. And as I would do this, there were even graphics and everything like that. It was well played out. Dad rejected it. Okay, rejection isn't just sort of, it's deliberate. It is with knowledge. It is with foresight. It is with a certain understanding and a willingness to choose B instead of A. That's what God is talking about here. That's the condemnation that befalls Judah is that they knew, they understood, and they chose to go this way. And so you look at the three things that he gets on to Judah about. They rejected the law of the Lord. They have not kept his statutes, but also the lies have now led people astray. Now remember, understand that when Rehoboam and Jeroboam take off as kings, things kind of trickled down. They didn't bubble up. You know, there are times in the Bible where people begin to rebel, and God's people get a little feisty and a little kind of, a little unnerved and everything like that, and it kind of bubbles up, and they begin to influence the leaders. And then you get a golden calf, for instance. In this situation, it actually bubbled down. It trickled down, where the kings made these decisions about false gods and new altars and things like that, and that bubbled down. The lies. So it wasn't just enough that they rejected, but that they had these lies that continued to feed it. And there was an issue. If you go back to Deuteronomy chapter 4, Deuteronomy chapter 6, Deuteronomy chapter 7, one of the things you begin to see is that one of the primary duty of God's people were to esteem him above all else, all others, and to keep his commandments. In fact, turn in your Bible to Deuteronomy chapter 11. We'll do that one real quick. Some of you have that memorized. Back there where some of the pages stick together more than you'd like. There in chapter 11, he poses this in verse 26. He says, "See, I am setting before you today a blessing and a curse. The blessing, if you listen to the commandments of the Lord your God, which I am commanding you today, and the curse, if you do not listen to the commandments of the Lord your God, but turn aside from the way which I am commanding you today, by following other gods which you have not known." That was God's deal from the very beginning. Time and time again, he told his people, hey, I'm going to do this for you. We're getting out of Egypt. We're doing this. I got this great place. And the rules are very, very simple. If you are with me, I am with you, and you will be blessed. If you turn from me, I will step back from you, and you will be cursed. That was the agreement. I mean, if you think about it, it's the same agreement God had in the Garden of Eden. It's the same agreement that he has with us today. When we are with him, now, things may not always go the way that we want them to, but we're blessed. But when we choose, when to reject, God just kind of steps back a little bit, and what happens, happens, and it's never in our favor. In fact, what we'll see as he says, then I'm going to send fire upon Judah, it will consume the citadels of Jerusalem. That happened about 150 years after Amos made this promise, when Nebuchadnezzar burned Jerusalem. And you can read about that in 2 Kings for those of you that want to do a little extra. So now we get to Israel. So here we are. Now Israel doesn't know this is coming. I mean, they think this is just Amos doing a who's who on all the people that they don't like, that they don't get along with, all the other people, kind of like we do sometimes, right? We love it when people rail against those that make choices that we don't make. Other people that get in trouble. Right? I mean, we like justice in that regard. Bring justice against the murderers, bring justice against that list of 6 people. Now, all of a sudden, it comes down, and the noose is around the neck of Israel. And from verse 6 through the end of this book, it's all about Amos bringing this rebuke, judgment, to Israel on behalf of God. Now, it starts in the same way. You know, in fact, if you look at it, it starts for 3 transgressions, and for 4, I will not revoke or hold back its punishment. I mean, really kind of between verses 6 through the end of this chapter kind of sets the tone a little bit for, you know, the seriousness, and everything else kind of falls in with this and is kind of a continuation of that theme. But what's different about this, I mean, it's similar in the sense of, you know, for 3 and not for 4, But what's a little bit different is it isn't until a little bit later on in this that he talks about the punishment. And the other thing that you'll notice that he begins to do, and really if you kind of look at how he spoke to the 6 pagan nations and also to a lesser extent Judah, Amos only gives one issue. So when he talks about Damascus, or when he talks about, he's talking about they sell people into slavery, or they burn the bones of the king, or they threshed pregnant women and killed them during battle. But it was just one thing. Here in just a short passage, he's going to go through about 7 things. And he's going to get very specific with Israel. It isn't just now he's turning his attention. It becomes this is the focus. And you begin to realize very quickly that everything that we had up until now was sort of the appetizer and the salad course. Now comes the main dish, and it's about to get serious. And he looks at this, and he looks at them, and he says in verse 4, for 3 transgressions of Israel and for 4, you'll see two categories, or I guess, call it 4 categories. It's probably the easiest way to look at it. When you look at this, you will see, just the things that offend him and everything like that. You'll see concepts of injustice. We'll talk about that in a second. You'll see oppression. You will see immorality. And you will see the dangers of kind of luxury to excess. Just in this, a few verses here, and everything else will then kind of feed underneath it. Here we start in verse 6. For 3 transgressions of Israel and for 4, I will not revoke its punishment. 2 things come up, because they sell the righteous for money, and the needy for a pair of sandals. Now hold on for just a second. And just kind of put your finger there. You don't even have to flip over to the New Testament. When you get to the New Testament, one of the things that you see that Jesus was always, trying to get them to understand is the manner in which you deal with people are a reflection of your faith. They will know that we are Christians by our wealth? No. By our giving? No. By our singing? Not really. By our love. In fact, you will go on to see when we look at Paul, one of the great things that Paul will get on to the churches about is there's 2 types of people that you always take care of. It all boils up to the needy. You take care of widows and you take care of children. And there wasn't a whole lot of tolerance for any church that did not look out for those that were less fortunate, those that did not have the ability to take care of themselves. And so it should shock us in no way that Amos, on behalf of God, is getting onto them for the fact that they were oppressing people and not treating people very nice. And in that, it was not just an affront to everything that God wanted them to do, but it was an indictment of their very faith. And he says, so first of all, and now understand that a lot of this language is really balled up, not just in sort of how they treat people maybe on the cul-de-sac or anything like that, but it really balled up into their judicial system. Because remember, keep in mind, this came top down from the kings. This was so permeated, it wasn't just a cultural norm. This is how their justice system operated. And if you've ever been around, there's nothing that we hate more. We like watching, nobody enjoys watching a movie where the little guy loses, right? We like a movie where the big bad industry is polluting the river and everything like that. The little guy comes in here and does a lawsuit and everything like that and is victorious. Those are the kind of movies that we like. We'll watch Dateline, we'll watch Nightline, we will watch 60 Minutes and everything like that. Give me a story where the little guy prevails. Chains himself to a tree so that the tree doesn't get bulldozed over by the evil developer and everything like that, right? Those are the stories we like. This is not that story. And during this particular time, and then we'll kind of ask rolling forward a little bit, if you were wealthy, if you had material things, justice looked very, very different. I can remember, it was not long after we moved here. My sister's husband was shot down in Bogota, Colombia. Killed. Singled out. And what we learned very quickly is just how he fared pretty well because his family was wealthy. And he had the option, his family had the option of paying a big fine, but not huge. And he literally got away with murder. And we look at that and we go, oh, that is horrible. We hate situations like that. We hate to hear about things like that. We hate to hear injustice on any, we just cannot stand it. But here, God's very people are being condemned for that. So when he says that the righteous are sold for money, he's not just talking about moral people, that the moral, that morality is being sold. Really what it's kind of better if you look at it is in the context of a lawsuit, in the context of a legal disagreement. The one who is morally correct, the one who is right, the one who has the just position, the correct position, loses because of money. And then he goes on to say that the needy get sold for sandals. Because remember, at this time, they settled lawsuits a little bit different than we do. And that you could literally bind a person. You could bind a family. You could bind, generations through a judicial decision from a wealthy person saying, you owe me money, and therefore you will be enslaved. And the concept of selling that person for a set of sandals is to show just how petty people had become. Now, I'm not talking about those fancy, expensive sandals that you kids like to buy. These sandals were pretty cheap back then, relatively speaking. And for something as petty as cheap shoes, needy people were sold into slavery and created a burden. He goes on to say, not that that wasn't bad enough, we get to verse 7. Those who pant after the very dust of the earth on the head of the helpless. So now we're going to put dust on the head of the helpless. And really what that means, a good translation is that they will trample on the head of the poor. Because to put dust on someone's head, well, first of all, generally speaking, you put dust on your own head. And it was a sign of grief. It was a sign of despair. It was a sign of how you viewed things and how you viewed life. It was very, very different to grab dust and put it on the head of somebody else. Because what that means, what Amos is saying is, you're trampling the poor. You are trampling those that can't take care of themselves, that can't fight for themselves or anything like that. And you're doing it intentionally. You're putting dust. He goes on to say, as part of that as well, they turn aside the way of the humble. Those that are humble, those that are right, not in an arrogant correctness, but just they are in the right. Just got deflected. You ever had that really good idea at work? You ever been right and been dismissed? More importantly, do you remember the time that your kids were right? It might not have involved a PowerPoint or anything like that, but they were right and you kind of dismissed it. How horrible you felt? Okay, that's what the Bible is talking about here. The Bible says, you did that. He goes on to say, and then we get to verse 7, the second half of the verse 7, and you get kind of the fifth thing where you begin to see that a man and a son resort to the same girl. That was explicitly outlawed in God's word. explicitly. Now, where it was tolerated and borderline promoted, certainly endorsed and okay, was in the Hittite law, that it was okay. And not even in marriage here, but for a father and a son, sexually speaking, to take on a young lady, the same young lady. And so in addition to everything else going on, we've got moral depravance here. And he gets on to them. In later on, the second to the last thing he talks about here, he talks about garments taken as pledges, they stretch out beside every altar. Again, this is something we don't do now, but back then, if you owed somebody, you could be compelled to give your jacket. Right? Because, you've got to take debts serious. I don't know that we do that much anymore, but back then, they took debts serious. But for the sake of humanity and just compassion, you gave them their jackets back at night, especially to the poor, because otherwise they would be very cold. The poor people slept in their coats. And so to have a judicial system that said, no, you give us your coat because you owe money. No, just, I know it's cold. I know it's dark. I know you don't have a warm home. You leave your coat where it is. Okay, again, it's a blatant disregard for people and a lack of compassion. Finally, he says, and in the house of their God, they drink the wine of those who have been fined. One of the things, they could fine in different kind of currencies and things like that, and one of the ways that they did it was wine. And he says, in addition to this absolute abuse of justice, you're going to drink the wine, and you're going to do it in the house of God. That was kind of the first, those are just 3 verses that are going to set the tone. Now, you could probably look at those 3 verses and say, you know what, I bet he could have gotten onto some of the other ones, but what changed, what makes this unique is verses 9 through the end of the chapter, and somehow we will quickly get through it. Because in 9 through the end of the chapter, but he's gotten their attention. These are your behaviors. These are the things you're doing. And it offends God. And then we get to verse 9, and you begin to understand just why it offends God. So many times in the Old Testament, especially as they're getting through Egypt, or not Egypt, as they're wandering and everything like that, it was always, whenever you heard a reference to God, oftentimes it was God who led you out of Egypt. Your father who led you out of Egypt. Here in verse 9, he says, yet it was I who destroyed the Amorites before them. And this is, from verses 9 through 12, is God saying, you're doing all this even though I set you up and fought against your enemies. I gave you battles and victories that you had no business winning. I gave you land. I gave you victory over people that you had no chance of defeating. It isn't just that you're doing it after I did all of these things for you and brought you into prosperity, brought you into safety, brought you into this living. Talks about people and things as big as cedars. Now what I want you to notice is verse 10, and we'll probably kind of have to end it, although technically you didn't do the timer thing, so I do not acknowledge. Nothing here. Anyways, you knew who you were getting when you asked me to teach. And you guys aren't going anywhere anyways. But look at verse 10. In verse 10, the tone changes a little bit. Because now it goes from third person to second person. And instead of talking about Israel sort of as Israel and this group of people, now he literally is pointing the finger and saying, you. What started as a message against pagan nations, what started as a message against that sort of pagan brother of yours in the faith, that had kind of fallen off the horse a little bit. What started as all of that, what then turned into, now we got to talk about Israel, all of a sudden in verse 10, and from here on out, God has made it very, very personal, and now it's become you. It was I who brought you up from the land of Egypt. I led you in the wilderness for 40 years, that you might take possession of the land of the Amorites. Then I raised up some of your prophets, sons of your prophets, and some of your men to be Nazirites. And this is where we'll end it. Is this not so, O sons of Israel, declares the Lord? It's one thing to get reprimanded. It's one thing to kind of get rebuked. The ones I always hated were the ones where it got second person pronoun real quick. You. And the ones that I really couldn't stand was when there was a question asked that we all knew the answer to, but I didn't want to have to admit. And he says, isn't this right, O sons of Israel? We'll stop there, and we will quickly pick up speed, and we'll catch that next week. Appreciate everyone being with us this morning. You can now move about, read the overhead sign, and get to your assigned seat.